Discrimination isn't always loud. Sometimes it hides behind forced politeness, quiet dismissals, and the assumption that no one will push back. On a routine flight, a flight attendant decided an old black woman didn't belong in first class. With veiled condescension and false authority, she corrected the mistake, moving her to economy without a second thought. She believed her actions would go unnoticed, that her power was absolute, that the passenger she humiliated would simply accept it. But the woman made one phone call. And when the plane landed, the flight attendant came face to face with the one person who could hold her accountable. By then, it was far too late. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. The airport terminal had been a steady hum of voices and movement, a chaotic blend of travelers navigating their own journeys, some hurried and impatient, others slow and burdened with the weight of their plans. Families struggled to keep restless children in check. Business professionals clutched their phones in one hand and coffee in the other, while weary passengers sat slumped against their carry-ons, exhaustion written in the heavy set of their shoulders. It was a scene Miriam Jenkins had witnessed countless times before, yet one she had never quite grown accustomed to, not because of the noise or the crowds, but because of the quiet undercurrent of expectation that followed her whenever she traveled, the subtle shift in tone when she stepped forward, the unspoken question in the eyes of those who had already decided she did not belong. Now, as she stepped onto the jet bridge, the energy around her changed. The terminal's overwhelming buzz faded into a controlled hush, replaced by the steady hum of circulating air conditioning and the sterile scent of disinfectant clinging to the walls. The artificial coolness of the cabin air brushed against her skin, a stark contrast to the warmth she had carried from the outside world, and she adjusted the blazer draped over her arm, her polished heels tapping softly against the floor as she approached the aircraft entrance with the quiet poise of someone who had long since learned the value of maintaining composure. At 78, Miriam carried herself with the kind of effortless grace that came from a lifetime of knowing exactly who she was, never needing validation from anyone who might look at her and see anything less than what she had built for herself. Her soft powder blue blouse was tucked neatly into pressed slacks, the sharp pleats still intact despite the hours she had spent waiting at the gate. A string of pearls, their luster unblemished by time, rested at her collarbone, a gift from her late husband that she had worn more times than she could count, a quiet symbol of the life she had built and the love she had known. Her silver-streaked curls framed a face that bore the evidence of experience, the lines at the corners of her mouth speaking to a history of both laughter and resilience. And though age had softened her features, there was still an undeniable sharpness in her dark brown eyes, the kind that had once commanded the attention of students in a classroom and, even now, demanded a level of respect that was not always freely given. She reached the entrance of the first-class cabin, where a uniformed flight attendant stood in position, posture straight, eyes scanning the approaching passengers with the careful precision of someone who took her role seriously. Her name tag read Rebecca Stone, and from the sleek bob tucked neatly behind her ears to the pristine white blouse that remained crisp despite the long shift, she carried the air of someone who considered herself an authority, a gatekeeper of sorts, relishing in the small power that came with deciding who was worthy of accommodation and who was merely an inconvenience. At that moment, however, her attention was on the elderly white woman in front of Miriam, a frail figure clutching her ticket with both hands, her fingers trembling slightly as she squinted down at the seat assignment, clearly struggling to make sense of the numbers. Rebecca's expression softened instantly, a warm smile spreading across her face as she leaned forward slightly, speaking with the kind of patient reassurance reserved for someone she saw as deserving of kindness. "Oh, sweetheart, I think you might be a little turned around. First class is up here, but your seat is actually in economy. No worries at all. I'll help you find your way." Her voice, light and honeyed, carried a gentle amusement, as if she found the woman's confusion endearing rather than inconvenient. The elderly woman let out an embarrassed chuckle, shaking her head as she pressed a wrinkled hand to her chest. "Oh dear, I do get confused sometimes. These tickets are so hard to read." Rebecca's response came effortlessly, her hand reaching out in a light, reassuring touch to the woman's shoulder as she gestured toward the economy section. "It happens all the time. Don't even worry about it. I'll make sure you get to your seat." The warmth in her tone did not waver, her movements practiced and easy. A seamless display of customer service wrapped in familiarity and unspoken assumptions. Miriam remained where she stood, watching, waiting, allowing the moment to pass without interruption. Then Rebecca turned to her. The shift was so immediate that it would have been almost imperceptible to anyone who had not spent a lifetime recognizing it. But Miriam noticed it in the way the woman's posture stiffened, in the flicker of hesitation that passed through her eyes before she even glanced down at the ticket in Miriam's outstretched hand. Gone was the easy warmth, the accommodating tone that had dripped with reassurance just moments ago. The welcome that had come so effortlessly for the elderly woman before her did not extend to Miriam. Instead, Rebecca's gaze flickered downward, scanning the leather handbag resting in the crook of Miriam's arm, the pearls at her throat, the neatly pressed clothes that marked her as someone who did not simply stumble into a first-class seat. There was no outright frown, no blatant expression of disapproval, but there was a moment, a brief but telling moment, where Rebecca seemed to weigh something in her mind, as if something about Miriam's presence required an extra second to process. She did not take the ticket immediately. Instead, her lips pursed slightly, her head tilting ever so subtly as she asked, "Are you sure you're in the right place?" The words were light, casual, laced with a feigned politeness that barely masked the undercurrent of doubt beneath them. It was not an outright accusation, not a demand, but rather the kind of question that people like Rebecca had perfected, one that gave them just enough plausible deniability to claim innocence if ever confronted, one that could be dismissed as mere helpfulness rather than what it truly was, an assumption that Miriam did not belong. Miriam had heard it before, had endured variations of it in different forms, in different spaces, from different people who all carried the same quiet certainty that she needed to justify her own presence. She did not react, did not let the question register as anything more than what it was, an attempt to provoke, to remind her of where she was supposed to be in the eyes of others. Instead, she held Rebecca's gaze with a patience that had been honed over years of encounters just like this one, extended her ticket a fraction further, and spoke with a voice that remained as steady as ever. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them, a quiet tension that neither of them acknowledged outright, but both understood was there. Then Rebecca's smile returned, but it was not the same one she had given the elderly woman moments ago. It was thinner, stiffer, something more akin to tolerance than genuine politeness. She finally took the ticket, her eyes flicking over it with barely a glance before handing it back, as though the confirmation of Miriam's first-class status had disrupted an expectation she had already set in her mind. "First class," she murmured under her breath, almost as if she had been expecting the paper to say something else. Then, stepping aside with an air of forced composure, she added, "Right. Well, enjoy your flight." There was no warmth, no professional courtesy beyond what was required. It was a dismissal, nothing more. Miriam did not offer her a response. She had no interest in validating the game Rebecca thought she was playing. She could tell that she hated the fact that a black person was in first class. Instead, she stepped past her without hesitation, moving toward her seat with the kind of deliberate ease that made it clear she had no intention of justifying her own presence. The weight of quiet observation settled over her as she entered the first-class cabin, the subtle shifts of posture, the quick but noticeable glances that marked her arrival. She had expected it. She had prepared for it. And she knew exactly how this was going to go. Miriam settled into her seat with the practiced composure of someone who had long since learned how to navigate spaces that were not always welcoming. She placed her handbag neatly beside her, smoothed a hand over the crease in her slacks, and allowed her gaze to travel across the first-class cabin, taking in the other passengers who had barely acknowledged her presence. A businessman in a tailored suit scrolled through his phone, a woman in a silk blouse adjusted the seat's reclining function, and a young man with noise-canceling headphones leaned back, already lost in whatever music was playing through his device. They had all been served already, their glasses of champagne resting on armrests, condensation beading along the delicate flutes. Miriam had expected her drink to arrive shortly after she had requested it, the way it had for the others. First-class service, after all, was supposed to be seamless, needs anticipated before they even had to be spoken. But as the minutes stretched on, it became increasingly clear that her request was not a priority. Rebecca moved through the aisle with effortless ease, chatting lightly with another passenger, flashing a warm smile as she refilled a glass for the businessman seated across from Miriam. The man had not even needed to ask. His drink had barely been half empty before she had appeared beside him, offering more with a gracious nod. She leaned in slightly, a polished professional presence, her voice light with friendly banter. "Long day ahead?" the man chuckled, shaking his head. "Too long? Might as well make the most of it while I can." Rebecca laughed in return, pouring smoothly before turning toward the next guest. She continued her rounds, moving down the row, tending to each passenger with the kind of attentiveness that was expected of first-class service. And yet, Miriam's glass remained empty. The realization settled in with the weight of familiarity. A situation she had encountered in different forms throughout her life, always subtle, always deniable, but never accidental. The delay wasn't an oversight, it was a decision. She let her eyes follow Rebecca's movements, watching as she approached another passenger, bending slightly as she engaged in pleasant conversation. The moment was so routine, so effortless in its casual grace, that anyone not paying attention might have missed what it truly was. Miriam, however, was paying attention. She knew how these things worked. The unevenness of treatment was never outright. There was no overt refusal, no confrontation, just a series of small exclusions that, on their own, seemed insignificant. A delay in service here, an omission there, a lingering hesitation where none should have existed. Little things that could be excused away as mere oversight. Coincidences that, when called out, would be met with innocence, with confusion, with, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I must have just forgotten." But Miriam knew better. She turned her gaze toward the window, her expression remaining carefully neutral as she counted the minutes passing. She had been patient all her life, but she had never been passive. Finally, after nearly 20 minutes, Rebecca reappeared beside her seat, her notepad still in hand, her posture as composed as ever. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked, the question delivered with polite detachment, as though she had not already taken Miriam's request earlier. Miriam's lips pressed together for only a moment before she let out a slow, measured breath, reminding herself that she had spent decades teaching young minds how to recognize their own worth, how to stand firm, even when the world tried to make them small. Her eyes lifted to meet Rebecca's, calm and unwavering. "Yes," she said, her voice smooth but deliberate. "I would like the glass of champagne I ordered earlier." Rebecca blinked. The flicker of hesitation in her face was brief, but telling. "Oh." A beat of silence passed before she tilted her head slightly. "I must have forgotten." Miriam did not respond. She simply held her gaze, allowing the silence to stretch between them, watching as Rebecca's expression tightened ever so slightly before she forced a small, dismissive smile. "I'll bring that right out," Rebecca added quickly, straightening as she turned away. Miriam continued to watch her as she walked toward the galley, the flight attendant's steps just a little too fast, her shoulders just a little too stiff, the first sign of something unspoken shifting between them. It did not take long for Rebecca to return, but when she did, The moment was accompanied by another small, calculated slight. The champagne glass, when placed before Miriam, was not chilled like the others had been. The stem had no condensation, the liquid inside already beginning to flatten, lacking the crisp effervescence of the ones served earlier. It was a detail small enough to be brushed off, easily ignored by someone who was not looking for it. But Miriam was looking for it. She had spent a lifetime recognizing the ways in which people like Rebecca exerted their quiet power, not through loud declarations or blatant actions, but through the kind of dismissiveness that could always be denied, always framed as unintentional. Rebecca did not linger. She did not ask if there was anything else Miriam needed. She simply placed the glass down with practiced indifference and moved away without another word. Miriam exhaled slowly, pressing the tips of her fingers together in her lap. She had seen this game before, had been forced to endure it in offices, in fine restaurants, in places where people like Rebecca had decided that she was somehow out of place, where service was given with reluctance, where patience was tested in ways that it was not for others. She took the glass, turning it in her hand, feeling the warmth of it against her palm, the lack of chill confirming what she already knew. But still, she brought it to her lips, taking a slow sip, never once breaking composure. She would not give Rebecca the satisfaction of showing even the slightest hint of irritation. She had already won the first battle, simply by existing in this seat. Rebecca, however, did not seem ready to accept that. Not yet, because the champagne was just the beginning. Miriam set the warm champagne flute back onto the tray, its lack of chill a quiet but deliberate statement. She did not react, did not acknowledge the slight, only allowed her fingers to rest against the armrest of her seat, her polished nails tapping lightly against the smooth leather. She had been patient all her life, and this moment would be no different. The game Rebecca was playing had been played before, and it was always the same. Subtle dismissals, carefully curated moments of exclusion that would never be loud enough to be called what they were, but would be felt nonetheless. She watched as Rebecca continued moving through the aisle, still tending to other passengers with ease, still offering smiles that came effortlessly to those she had deemed worthy of them. She leaned down slightly to adjust a tray for a man in the row ahead, speaking in light, easy tones, her polished professionalism firmly intact. And then the announcement came. "Ladies and gentlemen, our meal service will begin shortly." The voice of the lead flight attendant carried smoothly through the cabin, a practiced tone meant to evoke the comfort of premium service. "Our first-class passengers will be served their selection of entrees momentarily. Please take a look at the menu provided in your seat pockets and let us know your preference." Almost immediately, murmurs of approval filled the cabin, passengers reaching for the neatly printed menus tucked into the compartments beside them. Miriam took hers carefully, unfolding the thick paper and scanning the selections with the same attention she had always given to the details of any situation. It was a small menu, as expected. 2 primary entree choices, both designed to appeal to different palates. The first option was a standard filet mignon paired with buttered asparagus and whipped potatoes, a dish tailored to the traditional luxury traveler. The second was something that made Miriam pause, a dish labeled Southern-style braised short ribs with collard greens and cornbread. She let her eyes rest on the words for a long moment, the choice both obvious and intentional. When Rebecca reappeared at her side, notepad in hand, her expression was as carefully neutral as it had been before, though there was a flicker of something else in her eyes, something that rested between curiosity and expectation. "Have you decided on your meal, Ms. Jenkins?" The question was smooth, polished, offered with a feigned professionalism that was just detached enough to be impersonal. Miriam lifted her gaze, meeting Rebecca's eyes evenly. "I'll have the filet." Rebecca's smile barely flickered, but the moment of hesitation was unmistakable. "The short ribs are available as well," she offered, her voice carrying just the slightest nudge of suggestion. "It's a popular dish." Miriam didn't blink. "I'm sure it is," she said, her voice as even as ever. but I'd like the fillet." Another pause, shorter than the last, but no less telling. Rebecca nodded, finally making a note on her pad. And for a brief second, Miriam thought the moment had passed, thought that perhaps the game had ended, at least for now. But then Rebecca lifted her head again, her tone shifting into something that attempted to mimic casual conversation, but failed in its execution. "I've noticed that a lot of passengers with certain backgrounds really enjoy the short ribs," she smiled, a smile that did not reach her eyes. "I'd just hate for you to miss out on something you'd find comforting." The words were carefully chosen, placed in such a way that they could be denied if questioned, but their meaning was undeniable. There it was, the assumption, the carefully veiled remark, wrapped in the pretense of helpfulness, but laced with a condescension that burned hotter than if it had been outright. Miriam remained still, not a single change in her expression, not a single flicker of irritation that would give Rebecca the satisfaction she was so clearly looking for. "I'm quite comfortable with my choice," Miriam said, her voice smooth as silk, not a single edge betraying the weight of the moment. "Unless, of course, the fillet is not available to me." Rebecca blinked, her composure flickering for the first time. "Oh no, of course not," she said quickly, her fingers tightening just slightly around the notepad. "It's just that we sometimes run low on certain dishes, and I wanted to make sure you had the opportunity to enjoy something you'd be more—" She caught herself. The unfinished sentence hovered between them, its intent clear even in its incompleteness. Miriam held her gaze for a long moment, letting the silence stretch between them, watching as Rebecca's discomfort began to surface in the smallest of ways. The slight shift of weight from one foot to the other, the way her nails tapped against the cover of the notepad, the barely perceptible stiffness in her shoulders. "I see," Miriam said finally, her voice unwavering. "Then I'll be sure to savor my fillet." Rebecca's smile was tighter this time, the mask slipping just enough for Miriam to see the irritation buried beneath it. She gave a curt nod, scribbling something onto the notepad before snapping it shut. "Of course," she said quickly, before stepping away, her posture rigid, her movements just a little too brisk. Miriam exhaled slowly, allowing herself the smallest of smiles as she leaned back into her seat, her fingers resting lightly against the pearls at her collarbone. She had been right. The champagne had only been the beginning. Rebecca was determined to make this flight as uncomfortable as she could for Miriam, but what she didn't realize was that Miriam had spent decades enduring women like her, and she was still here. Miriam sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression smooth, betraying nothing, though beneath it all she could feel the slow, steady rise of something she had long since mastered, the patience of endurance. It was the kind of patience that had been necessary for women like her, the kind of patience that allowed her to sit through moments like these with the grace of someone who had seen it all before, and outlasted it every time. The meal service began soon after Rebecca had taken the orders, the clinking of silverware and the quiet murmurs of conversation filling the first-class cabin. Passengers received their trays with murmured thanks, flight attendants moving through the rows with practiced ease, placing down porcelain plates, offering refills, making small talk in the polite, detached way of those accustomed to luxury service. Miriam waited, allowing herself a glance at the meal carts as they rolled past, seeing the careful way the entrees were plated, the filet resting beside buttered asparagus, a drizzle of sauce pooling perfectly along the porcelain, the short ribs served with golden cornbread and slow-cooked greens. Each dish carried the same careful presentation. Yet when Rebecca appeared beside her row, holding Miriam's tray, there was something different about this one. The plate was set down before her with barely concealed indifference, the motion a little less careful than it had been for the others, the placement a little less precise, but it was what rested on the plate itself that caught Miriam's attention. The filet, the same dish she had watched others receive, was not plated with the same care. The cut was thinner, the edges drier, as though it had been left sitting under a heat lamp longer than it should have been. The asparagus looked wilted, the sauce on the side already congealing slightly, as though hers had been left behind, separate from the others, waiting for her to accept whatever she was given. Rebecca did not linger, did not wait to see if Miriam would say anything, instead moving on to the next row as if she had done nothing out of the ordinary. Miriam exhaled slowly through her nose, her fingers tightening slightly against the silverware, the weight of the moment pressing down on her, not because it was unexpected, but because it was so terribly familiar. She had been given less care, less effort, less regard, a message disguised as a meal. She did not react, not immediately. Instead, she lifted the knife, slicing through the steak with slow precision, watching the way the overcooked meat resisted the blade, watching how the juice that should have been inside had already dried out, leaving it tough and unappealing. The cabin was quiet around her, the other passengers enjoying their meals, their conversations low and comfortable, unaware of, or more likely, uninterested in, the discrepancy that had been placed before her. Miriam pressed the knife down a little harder, the steel scraping slightly against the porcelain, a sound that might have gone unnoticed in any other moment, but now carried just enough weight to command attention. Rebecca was still nearby, speaking softly to another passenger, her voice light, composed, pretending not to notice. Miriam took her time. She did not raise her voice, did not call out, did not do anything that would allow Rebecca to feign surprise or innocence. Instead, she lifted the plate carefully, holding it up just slightly, and turned her head in Rebecca's direction, waiting just long enough for the flight attendant to feel the weight of her gaze. Only then did she speak. "Excuse me, Rebecca." Miriam's voice was calm, smooth but unyielding. Rebecca turned, schooling her expression into something neutral, though there was the faintest flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, something between irritation and calculation. "Yes, Ms. Jenkins?" she responded, her tone light, almost airy, as if the conversation was nothing more than a small inconvenience. Miriam did not blink. "There seems to be a mistake with my meal." She gestured slightly with the plate, though she did not move it far. "I ordered the filet, as you know, but it appears that mine is not quite the same as the others." Rebecca barely glanced at the plate. "Oh, I assure you, Ms. Jenkins, that's the same filet everyone else received." Miriam allowed herself a slow blink, letting the silence stretch just long enough for Rebecca to feel the weight of it. "That's interesting," Miriam mused, tilting her head just slightly, "because the gentleman 2 rows ahead received the same order, and yet his cut was twice as thick, cooked to a proper temperature, and served with fresh asparagus instead of something that appears to have been waiting on a tray for a little too long." Rebecca's smile did not falter, though there was a sharpness creeping into it now, something brittle, something forced. "I'm sorry if it's not to your preference," she said, voice still composed. "But unfortunately, once meals are plated, we can't make substitutions. You're, of course, welcome to switch to the short ribs. I'd be happy to bring them out for you instead." There it was again, the push, the subtle, insistent attempt to remind Miriam where Rebecca had decided she belonged. Miriam set the plate down carefully, folding her hands over the linen napkin in her lap, exuding the same quiet authority that had once made students straighten in their seats when she stood before them. "I don't believe I asked for a substitution," she said, her voice as steady as ever. "I asked for the meal I ordered to be served properly, the way it has been for every other first-class passenger on this flight." Rebecca's smile tightened. "I'll see if there's anything I can do," she said after a beat, though they both knew she would do nothing. She turned on her heel, moving back toward the galley, and though the matter was not yet over, there was something in the stiffness of her posture that told Miriam that this had not gone the way Rebecca had expected it to. Miriam exhaled slowly, her gaze moving back toward the untouched plate in front of her, her stomach no longer holding the same hunger it had before. This was not just a meal. It had never been about the meal. It had been a test, a message, a challenge issued in quiet defiance. And Miriam had met it, just as she always had. But she knew Rebecca was not done. She knew the worst was still coming, and she was prepared. She had been prepared for this her whole life. Miriam remained seated, her posture perfectly composed, her hands resting lightly over the linen napkin in her lap, fingers gently pressing into the soft fabric as she watched Rebecca disappear behind the curtain leading to the galley. The first-class cabin carried on in its usual rhythm, the quiet murmur of passengers engaged in comfortable conversation filling the space, the occasional clinking of glasses meeting porcelain, the subtle hum of the plane's engines blending into the luxurious stillness that defined this section of the aircraft. To anyone else, nothing had changed. No one had turned their head to take notice of what had just happened. No one had paid attention to the way Miriam's service had been deliberately withheld, to the dismissive way her concerns had been brushed aside, to the undeniable difference in treatment that had been carefully disguised beneath a veneer of professionalism. She had watched it happen in real time, the calculated delays, the polite but pointed insistence that she should have simply accepted what had been placed before her, the expectation that she would know her place, that she would not dare to demand anything more than what she had been given. It was not about the meal, just as it had never been about the champagne, just as it had never been about the ticket she had presented when she first stepped onto the plane. It had always been about the space she occupied, the discomfort her presence created, the silent, unspoken message that someone like her did not belong here. She had long since learned how to recognize these moments, had spent decades navigating them, had perfected the art of holding her ground without raising her voice, without giving anyone the ammunition they so often sought when they sought to turn dignity into defiance. And so, she sat there, her expression unchanged, her presence unmoved, waiting for what she knew would come next, waiting for Rebecca to return, waiting to see just how far she intended to go now that she had been quietly, firmly, denied the victory she had expected. It did not take long before the flight attendant reappeared. There was a difference in her demeanor this time, something almost imperceptible but unmistakably there. A quiet, simmering energy beneath the polished exterior, the certainty of someone who believed herself to be in control, who believed that she had already won, who believed that Miriam had no real power in this space, that she would do what so many had done before her, that she would let it go. She approached with slow, measured steps, taking her time, ensuring that she had positioned herself just right, that the moment was visible, that she was close enough to be heard by the passengers seated nearby, but not so close that she appeared confrontational. She stopped just beside Miriam's seat, her hand settling lightly against the headrest, her posture leaning in ever so slightly, just enough to create the illusion of a quiet, professional exchange, just enough to set the tone of the moment before Miriam had the chance to control it herself. When she spoke, her voice carried a precise, deliberate lift, just loud enough to reach the ears of those sitting within the nearest rows, just warm enough to sound accommodating, just careful enough to paint the interaction in a way that suited her. "I'm very sorry that you're not satisfied with your meal, Miss Jenkins," she said, her tone coated with the kind of exaggerated patience that suggested the problem was not the service itself, but rather the passenger who refused to be pleased. "We do our best to accommodate all of our passengers, but we have limited options once the meal service begins, and unfortunately, there's nothing more I can offer you." Miriam remained still, her posture unchanged, her hands still resting in her lap, her breathing as measured and even as it had been before, her gaze slowly lifting, meeting Rebecca's eyes with a level of calm that was, in and of itself, a quiet form of power. She had expected this. She had known, from the moment Rebecca had walked away, that she would not return with a proper meal, that she would not acknowledge her mistake, that she would not offer the same kind of smooth, effortless service that had been extended so easily to every other first-class passenger on this flight. Instead, she had returned to reframe the moment, Rebecca was no longer simply dismissing Miriam in private. She was making it public by raising her voice just slightly, just enough to be overheard but not enough to be accusatory. She was ensuring that the situation was reshaped before it could truly unfold. She was setting the stage in her favor, making it appear as though she was the patient, composed professional, while Miriam was the difficult passenger whose expectations were unreasonable, whose dissatisfaction was an overreaction, whose complaint was nothing more than an inconvenience. The weight of perception settled into the air. Miriam felt it happening in real time, felt the way the people around her had become aware of the interaction, felt the way their presence had shifted from passive to listening. Their curiosity piqued just enough that the moment had become a performance, and Rebecca was aware of it too. She let out a soft sigh, the sound calculated, placed with precision, meant to add the final touch to the narrative she was building. "I'd hate for this to become a misunderstanding," she added, her voice dipping into something softer, something that was meant to sound like kindness, but was, in fact, condescension wrapped in concern. An implication that this was nothing more than a miscommunication, that Miriam's perspective was flawed, that she was simply reading too much into something that had never been there to begin with. Miriam had spent too many years recognizing these moments, too many years understanding exactly how perception could be twisted, exactly how power could be wielded in ways that were quiet but devastating. She would not allow it to happen here. She tilted her head slightly, her voice carrying the same effortless authority that had once commanded the attention of students in a classroom, that had demanded respect in spaces where it was not freely given, that had ensured that even those who underestimated her never did so for long. "I never raised my voice," she said, her tone remaining steady, unbothered by the shift in audience, unshaken by the attempt to manipulate the narrative before it could form on its own. "I simply asked for the service I paid for, just like everyone else." Rebecca's smile tightened, just slightly, just enough that it could no longer pass as entirely genuine. Her fingers curled faintly against the back of the seat, her weight shifting subtly from one foot to the other, her carefully maintained control beginning to slip under the pressure of a woman who refused to bend to the expectations set before her. "Well," she said after a beat, her voice dropping just enough that only Miriam would hear, "some passengers expect a little more than they're entitled to." Miriam remained still. She did not move, did not blink, did not offer a single reaction that could be twisted into confirmation that she was exactly what Rebecca wanted the others to believe. And then, the final push. Rebecca leaned in slightly, her head tilting just so, her voice lowering to something just above a whisper, something designed to hit with full impact without ever leaving room for witnesses. "You must be more comfortable in the back of the plane where you belong." The words settled, heavy, pointed, deliberate. But Miriam had not survived this world by allowing moments like this to define her. She inhaled, her movements slow, steady, without urgency, without hesitation, without fear. She reached into her handbag, her fingers closing around her phone, her grip steady, her next step already decided. Rebecca had assumed she held the power in this moment. She had assumed wrong, and by the time the plane landed, she would understand just how wrong she had been. Miriam exhaled slowly, her fingers lightly tracing the linen napkin in her lap, her posture remaining perfectly composed as she reached into her handbag with quiet deliberation. She did not rush, did not hesitate, did not allow a single movement to feel reactionary or impulsive. Instead, she let her fingers brush against the soft interior lining before wrapping around the cool, familiar weight of her phone, lifting it to her ear with the same grace that had carried her through a lifetime of moments just like this. The plane carried on as it always had, the cabin humming with the gentle murmur of conversation, the clinking of glasses meeting fine porcelain, the steady hum of the engines beneath it all. No one turned their head, no one paid attention. No one realized that in a matter of minutes, everything that had just transpired would set in motion a chain of events that could not be undone. The line clicked, connecting after 2 rings. "Mom?" His voice was deep, steady, laced with warmth but sharpened by awareness. It was a voice that had spent years commanding boardrooms, navigating complex negotiations, leading an entire corporation with the kind of precision that made him one of the most respected men in his field. But before he had been any of those things, before the titles, before the authority, before the weight of responsibility that came with running one of the country's largest airlines, he had been her son, and in that moment, that was all that mattered. Miriam smiled faintly, a private expression that never quite reached her lips, her voice carrying the same effortless warmth that it always did when she spoke to him. "Hi, sweetheart," she said smoothly, her tone light, even, controlled. "I just wanted to check in." There was a pause. It was brief, but heavy, filled with awareness, filled with understanding, filled with the unspoken knowledge that something was wrong. Devon had spent his entire life listening for the things she did not say aloud, and he had already heard it. "Mama," he said, his voice shifting, the warmth still present but now layered beneath something else, something firmer, something focused, something that told her that he was already paying attention in a way that only a man who had been raised by her could. "What happened?" Miriam exhaled lightly, letting her fingers tap against the armrest in a slow, rhythmic motion, her voice remaining steady, poised, carefully measured. "Oh, nothing urgent," she said lightly, as if she were discussing something insignificant, as if she were simply recounting an observation rather than laying the groundwork for what was to come. "I'm on my flight now, and let's just say I've had a rather unique experience with one of your employees." The pause that followed was sharper this time. She could almost hear the shift in his posture, could picture the way he would be sitting up a little straighter, his mind already working through the details of a situation he had yet to fully hear. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, more deliberate, carrying the kind of controlled precision that had made him the man he was today. "What happened?" Miriam smiled faintly, adjusting her sleeve in an absent motion, keeping her tone as light as it had been before, never allowing even the smallest hint of distress to color her words. "Oh, it's been subtle," she mused, as if she were merely making conversation, as if this were nothing more than a passing thought. "A few delays in service here and there, a misplaced assumption or two, a meal that didn't quite receive the same care as the others, and, just now, a rather pointed suggestion that I might be more comfortable in a different part of the plane." Another pause, longer this time, sharper. Miriam let it breathe, let it settle, let Devon absorb exactly what she had just told him, let him understand the weight of it the way she knew he would. She could hear him inhale slowly, deep and controlled, but it did not carry the frustration that someone else might have felt. It carried something else entirely, something deliberate, something dangerous, something that had been sharpened by years of navigating a world that had tried, time and time again, to deny him the position he now held. "Who's the flight attendant?" Miriam tilted her head slightly, adjusting the pearls at her collarbone with slow, deliberate ease, her fingers brushing against the cool surface in a motion that was less about necessity and more about letting the moment stretch. "She'll introduce herself soon enough," she said simply, her words carrying no urgency, no rush, no doubt. Devon exhaled, slow, thoughtful, the kind of breath that carried weight, carried intention, carried the quiet calculation of a man who knew exactly how to handle moments like these. "What do you want me to do?" Miriam allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction, though her voice remained smooth, effortless, unbothered. She had been in this world long enough to know that there was no need for anger. There was no need for confrontation. There was no need for retaliation. Because the most powerful thing she could do was simply let the flight attendant continue believing that she had won. She inhaled deeply, letting her fingers tap lightly against the armrest before settling comfortably into her seat. "I want to play along," she said finally, her voice as calm as ever, carrying the kind of confidence that did not need to be loud to be heard. I want to see just how far she thinks this can go. Devon did not hesitate, did not question her, did not need any further explanation. You want her to keep going, he said. Though it was not a question, it was a realization, an understanding, an acknowledgement of exactly what his mother was doing. Miriam hummed in quiet agreement, letting the silence stretch between them for just a moment longer. For now, she said simply, but when we land, I want everything handled. I don't want her working another flight. I want disciplinary action for the crew that saw this and ignored it. I want the union representative informed. And I want a statement prepared. Devon exhaled, slow and deep. But there was no hesitation. It'll be handled before you step off that plane. Miriam allowed herself a small, knowing smile, though it never quite reached her lips. Good. She could hear the way his breathing had evened out, could feel the moment that everything clicked into place, could hear the shift in his voice, the certainty, the quiet inevitability of it all. I'll see you when I land, she said smoothly, her words flowing with ease, with certainty, with the quiet confidence of a woman who had already won. Devon chuckled lightly, though there was no humor in it, only understanding, only promise, only the assurance that this was already decided. I'll be waiting. And with that, Miriam ended the call, slipping her phone effortlessly back into her handbag, her posture unchanged, her presence as poised as it had been since the moment she stepped onto this flight. The passengers around her remained unaware, lost in their own worlds, blissfully oblivious to the fact that the man she had just spoken to was not just any son. He was Devon Jenkins, the CEO of this airline. And when this flight landed, everything was about to change. Miriam sat perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on the armrests, her posture composed and deliberate, as the first-class cabin continued around her as if nothing had changed. The quiet murmur of conversation carried on, the soft clinking of silverware against fine china punctuating the air, the occasional rustling of pages as passengers flipped through their newspapers or reached for their tablets. From the outside, everything remained the same, untouched, unshaken. But Miriam felt the shift. She had known it was coming, had felt it long before Rebecca returned, had seen it in the way the flight attendant lingered near the galley, pretending to be occupied while keeping a careful eye on her, in the way she had exchanged quiet words with another attendant, in the way she had waited. Now, as Rebecca approached again, stopping beside Miriam's seat, her posture firm, her expression composed but distant, the moment arrived. Rebecca's voice carried the same artificial warmth as before, carefully measured, perfectly controlled, her tone polite but calculated. "Ms. Jenkins," she said, the words slow, deliberately even, polished in a way that masked the true intent beneath them. "I wanted to inform you that there was a mistake with your seat assignment. It appears that when you checked in, there was an error in processing, and you were mistakenly placed in first class. Your correct seat is actually in economy. I'll be happy to escort you there now." The words settled over Miriam like a familiar weight, one she had carried in different forms, in different places, under different circumstances, but always the same at its core. Her fingers curled lightly against the armrest, pressing into the fabric, but her expression remained unchanged. "No," she said, her voice calm, her tone unhurried. "There isn't a mistake." Rebecca blinked once, her polite smile not faltering but tightening just slightly at the corners. "I'm afraid there is," she replied smoothly, clasping her hands neatly in front of her, her grip just a little too firm. "The system shows that you were assigned a different seat. It's a simple correction, nothing to worry about." Miriam let the moment stretch, let the silence settle into the space between them, let Rebecca stand there in the uncomfortable stillness of being challenged. "I checked in with this seat," Miriam said, her voice carrying the same steady ease. "I received my boarding pass. I took my assigned place." She tilted her head just slightly. Tell me, where exactly is the mistake? There it was. A flicker of something beneath Rebecca's poised expression. Not enough to be obvious, not enough to betray anything outright. But Miriam saw it, a hesitation. The briefest pause. The realization that this wasn't going to be immediate, effortless compliance. Rebecca exhaled, inhaled again, and plastered the same professional patience on her face. "Ms. Jenkins, I understand this is frustrating," she said, her voice slightly firmer now, a subtle shift from polite correction to authoritative insistence. "But unfortunately, these things happen. Our records indicate a different seat assignment, and we do have to follow procedures. I can assure you, economy seating is just as comfortable, and you'll still receive excellent service." Miriam's lips curved slightly, not into a smile, but into something sharper, something quieter, something that carried the weight of seeing straight through her. "Is that so?" she murmured. Rebecca did not like this. She had expected this to be simple. She had expected the woman in front of her to accept what she was told, to move quietly, to comply. But Miriam wasn't giving her that. Miriam was forcing her to push harder, to make the intent behind this decision clearer, to stand fully in the discomfort of what she was doing. Rebecca squared her shoulders, her voice growing firmer, still holding on to the illusion of civility, but with the quiet insistence of someone who refused to be questioned. "Ms. Jenkins," she said, leaning in slightly, lowering her voice, as though she were speaking with someone difficult, "I do need you to cooperate." Miriam felt the shift. The expectation had now turned into demand. Her grip on the armrest tightened briefly before she let it go, her breath slow and measured. "This is my assigned seat," she repeated, just a little louder this time. A few heads turned. Passengers in the surrounding rows glanced up from their books, their screens, their quiet conversations. Rebecca's smile did not falter, but her posture stiffened. She had wanted control of the situation. She did not want attention. "I understand your confusion," Rebecca said, her voice still calm, but with a pointed undertone. "I'm simply trying to correct an issue before it becomes disruptive." Miriam's eyebrows lifted slightly, her voice carrying a weight now that it had not before. "Disruptive?" she repeated. "I'm sitting in the seat I was assigned. How exactly am I being disruptive?" A quiet murmur rippled through the nearby passengers. Someone in the aisle seat shifted uncomfortably. Another person stole a glance at the flight attendant. Rebecca's fingers flexed slightly before smoothing over the front of her uniform. "Ms. Jenkins," she said, her voice lower, more controlled now, "I am simply trying to keep order on this plane. This is a safety issue. I have passengers complaining, and I need to resolve this as efficiently as possible." Miriam's lips pressed together, her pulse steady, her breath controlled, but the tension had now settled firmly between them. Rebecca had made a critical mistake. She had turned it into a spectacle. Miriam could see it now. The subtle shift among the passengers, the curious glances, the quiet discomfort of those who knew something was wrong but didn't quite know what to do about it. Rebecca had wanted to quietly remove her, to erase her presence from this space without notice, but now people were noticing. Miriam inhaled slowly, adjusting the strap of her handbag with quiet precision. Her movements slow, deliberate, unhurried. She had spent a lifetime in moments like these, had been here before, not in this exact way, not in this exact seat, not at 35,000 feet in the air, but in spaces just like this, in rooms where her presence had been tolerated but never truly welcomed, in places where people like Rebecca had made sure to draw a line, even when they smiled as they did it. There had been times when she had stood her ground immediately, times when she had refused to move, times when she had shattered the illusion of quiet compliance. But this was not one of those times. This time the game was different. So, she did what needed to be done. She let the resistance fade from her expression. Let Rebecca think she had won. Let the moment shift in a way that allowed the flight attendant to believe she was still in control. She inhaled smoothly, let her fingers release their light grip against the armrest, lifted her gaze to meet Rebecca's, and let the moment stretch just long enough that the flight attendant had to wonder. "I understand," Miriam said finally, her voice smooth, steady, carrying no urgency, no rush, no trace of anything Rebecca could latch onto and twist into defiance. For just a second, Rebecca hesitated. Miriam had forced her to push, had forced her to escalate, had forced her to expose herself, and now Rebecca had to own what she had done. Miriam reached down, smoothing the fabric of her blouse, adjusting the crisp lines of her skirt, making sure that every part of her was exactly as it had been before Rebecca spoke. Then, and only then, did she rise from her seat. The weight of the moment did not pass unnoticed. She could feel the quiet murmurs from nearby passengers, the way a few heads had subtly turned, the way glances had been exchanged. No one said anything outright. No one asked what had happened, but the seed had been planted. Rebecca had wanted this to be a private victory, a quiet, unnoticed moment where she could remove Miriam without consequence. Instead, she had given her an audience. With each step down the aisle, the shift became clearer. The dividing curtain between first class and economy loomed ahead, the invisible barrier that separated luxury from necessity, privilege from practicality, the space Rebecca had decided Miriam belonged in. She passed through it without a word. The atmosphere in economy was different. The space was more compact, the sounds more varied, the energy less still. The scent of reheated meals lingered in the air, the voices more casual, the comfort measured not in excess but in efficiency. A different flight attendant, one who had not been present in first class, one who had not been part of this exchange, offered her a polite smile, a small nod, gesturing toward an open seat near the center of the row. Miriam nodded in return, stepping forward without hesitation, lowering herself into the seat with the same level of grace that had always defined her. She smoothed her skirt once more, adjusted her handbag, folded her hands in her lap, and let the moment settle around her. Miriam's face remained unreadable, her posture steady, giving nothing away. She did not tense, did not frown, did not allow any trace of frustration to show. She had been in situations like this before, and she knew better than to let them see a reaction. She did not belong in economy, not because she saw herself as above it, but because she had paid for her seat in first class, only to have it taken from her for reasons that had nothing to do with a booking error. But she did not belong in first class either, not on this flight, not in a space where someone like Rebecca had the power to decide who was welcome and who was not. Rebecca had been so focused on removing her that she had overlooked something important. There were people who had seen what happened, passengers who had exchanged glances, who had paused mid-conversation as she gathered her things, who had taken notice, even if they did not fully understand the weight of what they had just witnessed. There were now witnesses, and though no one had spoken up, there were unspoken questions hanging in the air. Miriam sat quietly in her new seat, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her expression calm despite the weight of the moment. The cabin around her carried on as if nothing had changed, passengers chatting in hushed tones, the flight attendants moving through the narrow aisles with trays of drinks and meals. No one in economy knew what had just happened, and those in first class who had seen it were now out of sight behind the dividing curtain. But the shift had already begun. Miriam could feel it. She had given Rebecca the space to make her mistake, had let her wield power as she saw fit, had allowed her to believe she had won. Now, all she had to do was wait. She reached into her handbag, fingers grazing over her phone once more. But this time, she pulled it out. Tilting the screen slightly away from view, she unlocked it with ease, scrolling through her contacts until she reached Devon's name. She pressed the call button. It rang once, twice. By the third ring, he answered. "Mama," Devon said, his voice steady, carrying that same low calmness that had defined him since he was a child. "Are you settled?" Miriam adjusted in her seat slightly, crossing one leg over the other as she leaned back. Her voice was just as smooth, just as composed, carrying no sign of frustration, no hint of anger, only quiet control. "For now," she replied, keeping her tone even. "It's exactly as we thought." She had no intention of stopping until she made sure I was out of that seat. Devon exhaled on the other end of the line, but it was not a sound of surprise. He had known, just as she had, that this was how it would play out. "She actually moved you?" "She framed it as a seating error," Miriam said, voice soft but firm. "Made it seem like a simple mistake, just an unfortunate correction. But we both know better than that." Devon was quiet for a moment, though she could hear the faint tap of his fingers against a desk, the sound of something being typed in the background. He was already moving, already setting things into motion. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. Miriam glanced around, taking in the space, the shift in energy, the way no one in economy paid her any mind. She had been placed here deliberately, meant to be out of sight, meant to feel small. But what Rebecca had not accounted for was that Miriam had never needed a particular seat to hold her presence. She smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "Let it play out a little longer," she said. "She's convinced she's won. Let her think that for just a bit more." Devon's voice remained steady, but there was something sharper beneath it now, something cool and deliberate. "And when the plane lands?" Miriam's fingers tapped lightly against the armrest, her gaze flickering toward the front of the cabin, where Rebecca was likely carrying on her duties without a second thought. "When the plane lands, I want you waiting at the gate." There was no hesitation on the other end of the call. "I'll be there." Miriam nodded to herself, satisfied. "She's expecting this to end quietly," she continued. "She's expecting me to walk away, to let it go, to say nothing. She's expecting that no one will remember what happened by the time they step off this plane." Devon's voice was lower now, colder. "She's expecting wrong." Miriam smiled again, this time just a little softer. "Yes, she is." She ended the call, slipping her phone back into her handbag, her posture unchanged. She folded her hands neatly in her lap and exhaled slowly, waiting, patient, knowing that the moment of reckoning was just on the horizon. This flight would land soon, and when it did, Rebecca Stone would finally understand the mistake she had made. Miriam remained seated, her posture composed, her hands resting lightly in her lap as the plane carried on around her. The hum of conversation, the rustling of snack bags, the occasional clink of ice in plastic cups, blending seamlessly with the steady vibration of the aircraft. To the untrained eye, nothing seemed out of place. The flight was progressing as any other would. Passengers were lost in their own worlds, and the crew moved about their duties with mechanical efficiency. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Miriam could feel it in the way Rebecca moved, in the way her presence lingered a fraction too long whenever she passed by, in the way her words had taken on a sharper edge while still wrapped in a professional tone, in the way she carried herself with the certainty of someone who believed she was untouchable. And she was not alone in this belief. The rest of the crew had seen what had happened. They had watched as Rebecca had removed her from first class under the guise of a clerical error, had listened as she spoke in carefully disguised slights, had been within earshot for every passive-aggressive comment and every thinly veiled attempt at asserting dominance. And they had done nothing. Not one of them had intervened. Not one of them had questioned Rebecca's decision, had taken a second look at the seating chart, had double-checked the manifest to confirm the so-called mistake. Not one of them had so much as glanced in her direction with even the slightest hint of concern. They had simply continued. They had ignored the way Rebecca's behavior had escalated, had turned a blind eye to the subtle insults, had made themselves willfully unaware of the quiet, calculated power play that had been unfolding between a flight attendant and a woman who had dared to sit where she had every right to be. And that, more than anything, told Miriam everything she needed to know. Rebecca was not acting alone. She was emboldened by their silence. She was reinforced by their inaction. She had tested the waters, had pushed just far enough to see if there would be resistance, had realized quickly that there would be none. not from her fellow flight attendants, not from the passengers who had seen and said nothing, not from anyone in a position to stop her. So she had continued, and when she returned, stopping once more beside Miriam's row, her presence exuding the same confidence, the same smug assurance, she carried herself as though she had already won, as though this moment, this flight, this space belonged to her, and her alone. "Ms. Jenkins," Rebecca said, her voice carrying that same thin layer of politeness that barely concealed the arrogance beneath it. "I just wanted to check in and make sure you're finding your new seat more suitable for your needs." Miriam lifted her gaze, meeting Rebecca's eyes with the same steady, unreadable expression she had worn since the beginning. There was no irritation, no anger, no outward sign that anything Rebecca had done had affected her in the way she had so clearly intended. "Oh, it's perfectly fine," she replied smoothly, her tone light, unbothered, giving nothing away. Rebecca's lips curved into a small, satisfied smile, the kind that did not reach her eyes, the kind that suggested she had expected this response, had wanted this response, had been waiting for it as proof that she had successfully put Miriam in her place. "That's wonderful to hear," she said, her voice just as light, just as casual, just as calculated. "I know some people prefer to sit up front, but I figured this would be a little more comfortable for you." The words were deliberate. Every single one. Miriam let them settle, let the silence stretch just long enough for Rebecca to feel comfortable, for her to believe that her message had been received exactly as she had intended. And then, with the same poise, the same unwavering composure, she nodded once. "I do appreciate your consideration," she said. She watched as something flickered behind Rebecca's eyes, something small but unmistakable. A pause, brief but telling. Rebecca had expected something else. She had expected resistance. She had expected frustration, or, at the very least, a crack in Miriam's perfectly controlled demeanor. But she had not expected grace. She had not expected calm. She had not expected a woman who refused to react, who refused to play the role that had been carved out for her in this moment. Rebecca recovered quickly, tilting her head ever so slightly, her expression still pleasant, but now edged with something else, something sharp, something dissatisfied, something that suggested she was trying to figure out if she had won or if she had somehow lost. "I also wanted to remind you that beverage service will be coming around shortly," she continued, her voice soft, her words carrying the same polite venom as before. "Though, I imagine we don't have exactly what you're used to drinking up front, but I'll see if I can find something for you." The remark was subtle, a carefully placed insult hidden beneath a customer service smile, the kind of comment that, if called out, could easily be dismissed as misunderstood. Miriam recognized it for what it was. She recognized it because she had spent her entire life recognizing it. She exhaled quietly, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest, her expression as composed as ever. She had made mental notes of everything, every moment of neglect, every calculated delay. Every word Rebecca had chosen with the precision of someone who had done this before. And she had also taken note of everyone else who had allowed it to happen. She had noticed the way the other flight attendants had looked away, had made themselves absent when Rebecca was near, had gone about their business as though nothing was happening, as though ignoring it made them free of responsibility. She had memorized their faces, because when this plane landed, it would not just be Rebecca who would have to answer for what had taken place here. Rebecca was confident now, so assured of her own untouchability, so certain that her position in this moment was safe, so emboldened by the silence of those around her that she had allowed herself to push further than she should have, and Miriam was going to let her. Because the only thing more satisfying than stopping someone like Rebecca in the moment was watching her walk right into her own downfall. She smiled, a soft, deliberate curve of her lips. Nothing forced, nothing strained, nothing that suggested she had been affected in the way Rebecca had hoped. "That's very kind of you," she said, her voice unwavering. "I trust your judgment. Completely." For the first time, Rebecca faltered, just slightly, just enough for Miriam to see it, just enough for the balance to shift in a way that was barely noticeable but undeniable nonetheless. And then, just as effortlessly as she had entered the moment, Miriam dismissed her, shifting her gaze away, adjusting the sleeve of her blouse, settling back into her seat as though Rebecca no longer existed in her world. The flight attendant lingered for a moment, her posture rigid, her presence still heavy in the air. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. Miriam did not watch her go. She did not need to, because this moment was no longer about Rebecca alone. It was about the entire crew that had chosen to stand by. It was about every injustice she had silently collected in the past few hours. And when this flight landed, none of them would be able to ignore it any longer. The familiar chime signaling the plane's final descent rang through the cabin, followed by the captain's composed voice announcing their arrival. The landing was smooth, barely a tremor as the aircraft touched the runway, the tires making contact with the ground in a seamless glide. A moment later, the slight jerk of deceleration pushed passengers forward in their seats as the plane began to slow, taxiing toward the gate with the same practiced precision that accompanied every routine flight. Around her, Miriam could hear the quiet rustling of passengers stretching, shifting in their seats, reaching for bags tucked beneath their seats or overhead compartments. The sound of seat belts clicking open filled the space in bursts, a chorus of movement as people prepared to disembark. A few passengers murmured to one another in quiet conversation, their voices blending into the background noise of the cabin, accompanied by the faint beeping of overhead indicators and the occasional tone of a flight attendant's radio. Miriam remained still for a moment longer, her hands resting lightly on the handles of her handbag as she let the energy around her settle. There was no rush in her movements, no urgency in her posture, no eagerness to push forward as others did. She had nothing to prove, nothing to scramble for, nothing to reclaim. She had already won. She knew it, and soon Rebecca would know it too. At the front of the cabin, Rebecca stood tall, her uniform pristine, her hair carefully smoothed into place, her posture exuding the same collected confidence she had carried throughout the flight. There was a quiet satisfaction in the way she held herself, an unspoken but unmistakable smugness in the slight lift of her chin, the composed set of her features, the way she prepared to send off passengers with that same professional but impersonal smile. In Rebecca's mind, this was a victory. She had executed her authority flawlessly. She had removed an unwanted presence from first class without incident. She had established the rules, dictated the terms, ensured that things were restored to the way they were supposed to be. Miriam had played along, had complied without protest, had walked away from first class without resistance, had taken every insult and carefully veiled slight with a smile. As far as Rebecca was concerned, the matter was settled. But the problem with people like Rebecca was that they never understood the difference between silence and submission. Miriam had never submitted. She had simply waited. Passengers began rising from their seats, stepping into the aisle as they reached for their belongings, collecting carry-on luggage and shoulder bags, adjusting their jackets and scarves as they prepared to step off the plane. There was a quiet sort of urgency to the movement, a natural eagerness to stretch their legs, to finally leave the confined space and return to the normal rhythm of their lives. But not all of them were distracted. Among them, scattered throughout the rows, were passengers who had seen just enough to understand that something was off. Some had been in first class when Miriam had first taken her seat, had seen her sitting there in quiet comfort, before she had suddenly, inexplicably, disappeared. Others had caught glimpses of the moment Rebecca had stood beside her in economy, her voice carrying just enough to sound pleasant, but edged with something sharper, something unmistakably cruel beneath the surface. And then, of course, there were those who had seen the call. They had watched as Miriam had lifted her phone, her movements slow, deliberate, her voice smooth and composed as she spoke to someone on the other end of the line. They had seen her expression, not angry, not desperate, but assured. And they had seen the way Rebecca had lingered after that, the way she had slowly distanced herself, as if she had suddenly felt something in the air that made her uncertain, something she had not anticipated. The whispers had already begun, soft at first, hushed, cautious, barely more than passing murmurs exchanged between those who had noticed but did not yet understand. "Did you see when she made that call earlier?" "I don't know. But something about all of this didn't sit right with me. She was in first class at the start of the flight, wasn't she? I don't know what happened." But the words faded as the first row of passengers stepped forward, moving toward the exit, passing Rebecca one by one as she stood poised near the front of the cabin, offering polite nods and empty pleasantries. She had heard none of the whispers. She had no reason to suspect anything was amiss. Her mistake had not yet caught up to her. Miriam, still seated, still waiting, allowed herself the smallest breath of amusement at that thought. Rebecca thought she had won. But Miriam knew better. She had watched. She had listened. She had taken mental notes of every single moment of neglect, every delayed response, every pointed comment, every instance of power wielded not as a duty, but as a weapon. And she had memorized every single person who had stood by and allowed it to happen. She had done what she always did. She had observed. And soon, when the plane landed, it would no longer be her silence that spoke. It would be the consequences that Rebecca never saw coming. With quiet precision, Miriam reached for the handles of her handbag, adjusting the straps against her wrist as she prepared to stand. She did not rush. She did not hurry. She did not push forward as the other passengers did, eager to be the first off the plane, because unlike them, she was in no hurry. Her time had already arrived, and soon, so would Rebecca's. As the familiar chime signaled that passengers could now deboard, the finality of the flight settled over the cabin. The overhead compartments clicked open in succession, the sound of bags being pulled down and adjusted, filling the space as passengers prepared to leave. Murmurs of conversation drifted through the air, some voices light and casual, others filled with the quiet exhaustion of long travel. The movement was orderly, routine, the kind of practiced disembarkation that happened on thousands of flights each day. Miriam remained seated for a moment longer, her fingers brushing absently over the handles of her handbag, her posture as composed as it had been from the start. There was no urgency in her movements, no rush to stand, no eagerness to push toward the exit. She had nothing to reclaim, nothing to prove, nothing to force. She had carried herself with grace throughout the entire flight, and she would carry herself with that same unwavering poise now. When she finally rose, she adjusted her bag over her arm and stepped into the aisle, moving forward at her own pace, never once allowing herself to fall into the frantic rhythm of the other passengers. There was no need. The moment she had been waiting for had already arrived, and now all she had to do was step into it. Rebecca followed close behind, her uniform still crisp, her chin lifted slightly as she prepared to disembark. Her expression carried the kind of quiet self-satisfaction that came with believing a situation had been handled perfectly. The past few hours had played out exactly as she had intended, with no pushback, no consequences, no interruptions to her authority. Miriam had taken her seat in economy without protest, had smiled through every thinly veiled insult, had accepted every indignity without a fight. As far as Rebecca was concerned, it had been a job well done, a successful display of control, a quiet confirmation that she had been right to make the decisions she had. But the problem with people like Rebecca was that they never knew when they had already lost. Miriam stepped off the jet bridge, her heels clicking lightly against the terminal floor. The transition from the enclosed space of the aircraft to the wide-open airport feeling like the final breath of a story reaching its inevitable conclusion. She did not pause, did not slow, did not turn to glance back at the plane she had just left behind. Instead, her gaze moved forward, settling immediately on the figure waiting just beyond the gate. There he was. Devin Jenkins stood poised and unshaken, his presence filling the space around him with an effortless authority that could not be ignored. The sharp navy of his tailored suit was immaculate, his polished shoes grounded in a way that made it clear he was a man who did not shrink in the presence of anyone. His stance was relaxed but deliberate, his hands casually tucked into his pockets, his posture exuding the quiet confidence of someone who was used to being in command of the spaces he occupied. And yet, despite the undeniable air of power that surrounded him, there was something else beneath the surface, something softer, something reserved for the woman now approaching him. His gaze met Miriam's with a quiet warmth, the edges of his composed expression softening as she neared, the corners of his mouth barely lifting in a small, almost imperceptible smile. Miriam, unhurried, exuding the same quiet power that had never left her, came to a stop beside him. Her presence, just as it had been on the plane, was steady, unwavering, untouched by the events that had unfolded. "Sweetheart," she greeted, her voice smooth and even, carrying no urgency, no rush, no sign that anything about this moment was out of the ordinary. Devin reached for her hand, lifting it with practiced ease, pressing a brief, affectionate kiss against her knuckles before lowering it once more. His voice, deep and steady, was as unreadable as his expression, his words flowing with the same measured precision he used in boardrooms filled with executives who had learned to listen when he spoke. "Did you have a good flight, Mama?" Miriam tilted her head slightly, her eyes briefly scanning his face, the barest hint of amusement flickering behind them, as though the answer to his question was already known, as though the weight of everything that had happened was acknowledged between them, without needing to be spoken outright. "It was enlightening," she responded, her tone as composed as ever, giving nothing away. Behind her, Rebecca was still in the process of stepping through the gate, her thoughts occupied with the usual post-flight tasks, her mind already moving toward the next stage of her shift. She had already dismissed everything that had transpired, already moved past the incident, already convinced herself that it had played out exactly as it should have. And then she saw him. For a moment, she did not think much of it, barely paying attention to the sharply dressed man standing at the gate, assuming he was just another businessman waiting for his flight, just another passenger meeting someone after a long journey. But then, slowly, unease began to settle in. Something about the way Miriam had walked toward him so effortlessly, something about the way he had greeted her with a familiarity that spoke of far more than casual acquaintance, something about the way he now stood at her side, his expression shifting ever so slightly as his gaze flickered toward Rebecca. It was only then, when he turned fully toward her, when he extended a hand with smooth precision, when his voice, even and professional, spoke with the weight of authority she had never expected to face, that the truth came crashing down around her. "Devin Jenkins," he introduced, his voice carrying no hint of excess emotion, no sharp edge of anger, no need for volume to make himself heard. "CEO of this airline." The weight of the words landed like a thunderclap, an invisible force striking directly at the center of Rebecca's chest, stealing the breath from her lungs before she even realized she had stopped breathing altogether. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. The self-satisfaction, the quiet smugness, the certainty that she had handled the situation exactly as she should have, all of it disappeared in an instant. There was nothing left in its place but pure, undeniable horror. She stood frozen, her hands stiff at her sides, her fingers twitching slightly as though unsure whether to clasp together or remain apart, her posture faltering for the first time since stepping off the plane. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but the words never formed, her mind racing, trying desperately to process what she had just heard, trying to understand how she had let this happen, how she had miscalculated so terribly. because now she understood. Now she knew exactly who she had spent the entire flight insulting, belittling, and mistreating. She had not just been cruel to an ordinary passenger. She had not just disrespected a woman she assumed had no power, no voice, no ability to challenge what had been done to her. She had spent the last several hours humiliating the mother of the man who ran the very company she worked for. And now, he knew. Devon did not speak again. He did not need to. His presence alone carried all the weight that was necessary. His eyes, calm and assessing, remained fixed on Rebecca, watching as she visibly crumbled beneath the realization of what had just happened, of what was about to happen, of what this moment truly meant. Miriam said nothing either. She simply stood beside her son, her expression unreadable, her presence unwavering, her silence speaking louder than anything that could be said aloud. Rebecca, unable to look away, unable to do anything except stand there, realized in that moment that she had made a mistake she could not undo. And now, there was no escaping it. As the last few passengers exited the plane and made their way into the terminal, the natural movement of travel continued without pause. People bustled about, adjusting luggage straps, checking their phones for notifications, scanning overhead signs for directions to baggage claim and connecting flights. The sounds of rolling suitcases, distant announcements over the intercom, and the quiet hum of airport activity filled the space, creating a sense of routine that contrasted sharply with the tension settling near the gate. Though many travelers remained focused on their own paths, some had taken notice of the moment unfolding before them. A few had slowed their steps, not quite stopping but moving at a pace just slow enough to observe the undeniable shift in energy surrounding the three figures standing near the gate. Some of them had been on the same flight, had witnessed fragments of what had transpired in the air, had seen the quiet mistreatment unfold seat by seat, exchange by exchange. Others had not seen it firsthand, but could sense that something was happening now, something significant, something that carried the weight of accountability. Miriam remained poised, her expression as composed as it had been throughout the entire ordeal, her posture giving no indication of triumph or vindication, only the same unshaken grace that had always defined her. There was nothing about her stance that suggested victory, nothing in her features that reflected satisfaction or the need to bask in Rebecca's growing discomfort. She did not need to say anything at all. She had already spoken in the most effective way possible, by allowing the moment to speak for itself. Devon stood beside her, the sharp lines of his tailored suit unwrinkled, his shoulders squared, his presence commanding in a way that did not require force. He had not raised his voice, had not needed to exert any outward aggression to make his authority known, had not felt the need to dominate the space with anything other than his sheer existence. The quiet intensity of his gaze, the controlled patience in his posture, and the deliberate precision of his words had already done more damage than any outburst ever could. Rebecca had once carried herself with the same confidence, had once walked through the plane with the certainty of someone who believed she held all the control, had once spoken with the assurance of a woman who thought she would never be questioned. But now, standing in the shadow of her own mistake, confronted with the undeniable weight of what she had done, she looked as though the very foundation beneath her feet had been ripped away. She had stepped off the plane, still believing she had handled the situation perfectly, still convinced that she had done nothing wrong, still thinking that her actions would carry no consequences. But now, faced with the truth she had so easily overlooked, she struggled to find her footing, to regain the composure that had once come so easily. Devon did not rush the moment, did not allow her the luxury of avoidance, did not give her an easy way out. He did not glare, did not sneer, did not offer the kind of outward hostility that might have allowed her to twist the situation into something else entirely. Instead, he remained perfectly still, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make sure that she fully understood the depth of her mistake. When he finally spoke, His voice remained as level and composed as ever, carrying none of the emotional outbursts that Rebecca might have expected, none of the rage that might have given her something to argue against, nothing but the quiet, undeniable weight of disappointment. "I trust you understand that your actions during this flight were unacceptable," he said, his tone even, his words measured, his expression betraying nothing beyond the absolute certainty of his statement. Rebecca inhaled sharply, her lips parting slightly, her hands clasped in front of her in a way that suggested she was grasping for control, reaching for something steady to hold on to as the moment began to spiral further from her grasp. She had spent years learning how to smooth over difficult encounters, had learned how to deflect complaints, how to redirect blame without making it obvious, how to soften an uncomfortable situation before it had the chance to grow into something she could no longer contain. And so, she latched onto the only thing she could. "Mr. Jenkins, I assure you, there must have been some sort of misunderstanding," she said, forcing a smile that no longer carried the easy confidence it once had, her voice a touch too high, a shade too eager, her posture tense despite the effort to appear composed. Devon did not move, did not shift in the slightest, did not react beyond allowing her words to hang in the space between them, waiting for her to hear how hollow they sounded in the face of what had already been made clear. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, as if turning the phrase over in his mind, letting the weight of it settle, letting her hear it spoken aloud before he dismantled it entirely. Rebecca nodded quickly, taking the lack of immediate aggression as a sign that she might still have a way out, mistaking his patience for leniency, mistaking his restraint for hesitation, mistaking the quietness of his presence for an opportunity to regain control. "Yes, sir," she insisted, forcing herself to push forward, scrambling for whatever explanation might seem the most reasonable, the most believable, the most convenient. "There was some confusion with the seat assignments, and I was simply following standard procedure. There was never any intention to cause offense. I was only doing my job." Devon inhaled deeply, the faintest trace of something sharper flickering behind his gaze, as he exhaled just as smoothly. He had already known she would say something like this, had already anticipated that she would reach for protocol as a shield, had already expected that she would attempt to frame her actions as nothing more than an unfortunate necessity. "Your job," he repeated, his voice remaining as steady as before, though now carrying the distinct weight of someone who was no longer willing to allow space for excuses. "Your job was to ensure that every passenger aboard that flight was treated with the same level of respect, the same level of professionalism, the same level of courtesy. Your job was to uphold the standards of this airline, to carry out your responsibilities without bias, without personal judgment, without making decisions that were based on nothing more than an assumption of who did and did not belong." Rebecca swallowed hard, her fingers tightening slightly around the hem of her uniform jacket, her breathing growing just a fraction more uneven. "Sir, Devon did not raise a hand to stop her, did not interrupt with force, did not need to cut her off with anything other than the sheer finality of his next words. "I don't need to hear what you meant," he said, his voice unwavering, allowing no room for misinterpretation, no space for justification, no opportunity for her to escape what had already been done. "I only care about what happened, and what happened is very clear." Rebecca's throat bobbed as she swallowed again, as if physically trying to force down the weight of her own mistake, as if willing the moment to pass before it could consume her entirely. "You said this was a misunderstanding," Devon continued, his tone never breaking, never shifting, never rising in volume but carrying every ounce of the authority he had never needed to assert outright. "Would you like me to pull up the flight recording? Because I assure you, every moment of that flight is documented, every interaction recorded, every decision you made preserved. And if that isn't enough, I have passenger testimonials as well. People who saw, who heard, who witnessed exactly what happened." Rebecca's face grew impossibly pale, her entire body stiffening under the realization that this was no longer something she could control, no longer something she could talk her way out of, no longer something that would disappear into nothing. There was no misunderstanding. There was only the truth. Devon had not needed to raise his voice. Miriam had not needed to say a word. Rebecca had spent the entire flight believing that she held power over the situation, believing that she was the one in control. But as she stood beneath the crushing weight of what she had done, with the eyes of passengers lingering in quiet understanding, with no excuse left that could possibly save her, she understood the truth in its entirety. She had never been in control, and now there was no escaping what came next. Rebecca had been standing in this terminal countless times before, watching passengers disembark, exchanging pleasantries with the crew, moving seamlessly between flights without a second thought. She had perfected the art of composure, had cultivated a presence that exuded control, had carried herself with the effortless confidence of someone who had never truly had to answer for the way she wielded power. But this moment was unlike anything she had ever experienced, because for the first time in her career, she could feel control slipping from her grasp with every passing second. The arrogance that had carried her through the flight, the sense of superiority that had fueled every decision she had made, the certainty that she was untouchable, all of it cracked, then shattered, then collapsed entirely. She had stepped off the plane with her chin high, her shoulders squared, convinced that whatever had happened in the air had already been settled, that Miriam had been put in her place, that there would be no consequences waiting for her on the other side. But now, as she stood beneath the weight of her own miscalculation, staring at the man whose name carried authority over every single inch of this airline, the truth pressed down on her with a force that threatened to suffocate. Devon's expression did not change. He did not gloat, did not sneer, did not react with anything other than quiet, controlled disappointment that cut deeper than any outburst ever could. The silence surrounding them was deafening, heavy with an anticipation that made Rebecca's skin crawl, her hands suddenly unsteady where they had once rested so confidently at her sides. She opened her mouth, as if to speak, as if to offer another desperate attempt to reframe the situation, but no words came. She had already run out of excuses. Devon inhaled slowly, exhaled just as smoothly, his posture never shifting, his voice never rising. When he finally spoke, his words were deliberate, steady, carrying the weight of a decision that had already been made. Effective immediately, you are placed on suspension, pending a full investigation into your actions on this flight, he said, leaving no room for negotiation, no opening for argument, no indication that this was anything but final. Rebecca's entire body stiffened, her breath catching in her throat as the words settled, as the reality of what was happening took shape in real time. She had always been the one dictating the terms, the one setting the expectations, the one ensuring that others understood their place. But now, it was being dictated to her. Her mouth opened again as though some part of her still believed there was a way to claw her way out of this. But Devon didn't give her the opportunity. "This is not up for debate," he continued, his tone unwavering, as professional as it had been from the moment she stepped off the plane, but carrying the full weight of consequence. "You will be contacted by corporate regarding next steps, and until this matter is resolved, you are not to report for duty." The words felt like a physical blow, striking harder than she had expected, sending a chill through her that she could not ignore. Passengers were still moving around them, some walking by, others lingering at a distance, their eyes flickering between Rebecca and the man who had just stripped her of the authority she had once wielded so easily. The crew members who had worked alongside her on this flight, some standing nearby, others pretending to be occupied with post-flight duties, had all gone still. The murmurs started almost immediately, whispers passing between flight attendants, the slow realization that this was not just a single reprimand. This was something bigger. And then, as if drawn by the gravity of the moment, the captain, who had previously remained uninvolved, focused on the logistics of landing and ensuring that all procedures were followed, stepped forward. Captain Elliot Hawthorne had been with the airline for nearly 2 decades, a man known for his professionalism, for the ease with which he carried authority, for the way his presence alone commanded respect. He had not been aware of what had transpired during the flight, had not been involved in the conflict that had unfolded in the cabin, had not heard the subtle insults, or witnessed the power play that Rebecca had engaged in so effortlessly. But now, as he observed the aftermath, as he took in the unreadable expression on Devon's face, as he glanced at Miriam, still standing tall beside her son with unwavering grace, as he saw the way Rebecca stood frozen beneath the weight of consequence, realization settled over him. His gaze shifted toward Devon, then to Rebecca, before finally landing on the rest of the crew. "What exactly happened here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm, his eyes scanning the attendants who had worked this flight. No one answered right away. Rebecca, who had once carried herself with such absolute certainty, remained silent, her throat tightening as she realized that this was not just about her anymore. Devon's gaze flickered toward the other flight attendants, those who had stood by as Rebecca made her decisions, those who had watched Miriam be treated as less, those who had seen but had done nothing. "This was not just one person's failure," he said, addressing all of them now. "This was a failure in leadership. This was a failure in service. This was a failure in basic human decency." His voice remained calm, but there was no mistaking the finality in his tone. "And there will be accountability for every single person who allowed it to happen." Rebecca flinched, the panic she had been suppressing breaking through the last of her composure as she glanced at the others, as though searching for some kind of shared defense, some way to lessen the burden now resting solely on her shoulders. But there was none. One of the attendants, a younger woman named Sarah, who had barely spoken throughout the flight, who had turned away from confrontation at every opportunity, shifted uncomfortably, her hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Another, a man in his 40s named Kevin, who had taken over first-class service after Miriam had been moved but had never once questioned why it had happened, inhaled sharply, his eyes flickering toward the captain as though waiting for some kind of direction, some way to remove himself from the situation entirely. But there was no escaping this. Word had already begun to spread. The truth had already begun to take root. Miriam had said nothing. She had simply allowed the moment to unfold. And now, as the weight of every decision, every action, every failure to act settled over the people who had been complicit in what happened, the reckoning had begun. Rebecca had started this flight believing that she had control over everything. She had ended it, realizing that she had controlled nothing at all. And now, she was not the only one who would face the consequences. The murmur of conversation that had once been restrained to hushed whispers among the passengers and crew began to swell, no longer confined to private speculation, but now taking shape in the form of voices that refused to remain silent. The passengers who had witnessed Miriam's mistreatment firsthand, who had exchanged uneasy glances during the flight, who had sat in discomfort as Rebecca's authority went unchecked, were now stepping forward. A woman in her 50s, dressed in business attire, adjusted the strap of her leather tote and cleared her throat as she stepped closer to the conversation unfolding between Devon, the captain, and the flight attendants. "I was in first class when this happened," she said, her tone firm but composed, her eyes landing directly on the captain as she continued. "I saw when Ms. Jenkins was moved. I remember thinking at the time that something about it felt wrong. It wasn't handled like a mistake, and it certainly didn't look like it was a simple seat reassignment." Another passenger, a younger man with a backpack slung over one shoulder, nodded in agreement, his hands tightening around the strap as he spoke. "I didn't want to assume the worst when I saw it happen," he admitted, glancing at Miriam. "But when I heard the way the flight attendant spoke to her, the way she was treated for the rest of the flight, It became pretty clear that this wasn't just about a seat. He exhaled slowly, his grip tightening slightly. "I should have said something earlier." Miriam turned to him then, her expression still carrying the same warmth and patience she had displayed all throughout the flight, her eyes steady but kind. "It's never too late to speak the truth," she said, her voice smooth, unwavering, carrying no resentment, no bitterness, just an understanding that cut through the weight of the moment. The young man swallowed, nodding once before stepping back. Another voice, this one softer but just as insistent, rose from the small gathering crowd. "I was sitting near the front of economy," a woman in her 30s added, shifting slightly as she spoke, "and I saw when she was brought back. I remember thinking it didn't make sense. She carried herself like someone who belonged up there. And when I heard the way she asked for her meal, how polite she was, how patient she remained, it made what happened afterward so much harder to ignore." She glanced toward Rebecca then, her expression tightening. "I remember when she was offered something she never ordered. And I remember how it wasn't corrected the way it should have been." As more passengers spoke, their accounts layering over one another, the tension among the crew thickened. The reality of the situation was no longer just speculation. The truth had been set loose, no longer confined to quiet discomfort or stolen glances, but now taking shape as a record of events that could no longer be ignored. And it was about to spread far beyond this terminal. Unbeknownst to most of those present, a passenger standing toward the back of the gathering had already taken action. A younger woman, no older than 20, had been holding her phone discreetly at her side, the screen still glowing as she stared down at the video she had just uploaded. The footage, grainy but unmistakable, showed Rebecca standing in the aisle, her voice clipped, her posture rigid as she gestured toward the back of the plane, instructing Miriam to follow. The audio wasn't perfect, muffled by the natural hum of the aircraft, but it was clear enough. It captured the quiet but unmistakable authority in Miriam's voice when she had challenged the way she was being treated. It captured Rebecca's insistence that this was merely a correction of a seating issue, despite the tension in her posture that suggested otherwise. It captured the subtle shift in passengers as they watched, uncertain but unable to look away, feeling the weight of something they didn't yet have the words for. And now, it was online. Within minutes, the video had started circulating on social media, gaining traction faster than the person who had uploaded it could have imagined. Comments flooded in almost immediately, users demanding answers, calling out the blatant discrimination, questioning how something like this could happen in such a well-established airline. Outrage spread like wildfire. It wasn't just the footage that made it damning, it was the context, the voices of those who had been there, the clarity of what had transpired now woven together in a way that could not be undone. And then, the airline's name began trending. Devon had already anticipated this. He knew how quickly news spread, knew how fast an incident like this could escalate once it left the confines of an airport and entered the digital world. He did not react with shock, did not scramble to come up with a response, did not hesitate in the way so many companies did when faced with public scrutiny. Instead, he turned toward one of the assistants who had been waiting near the side, a woman in her 40s wearing a sleek corporate blazer, her expression already serious as she held a tablet in her hands. "Prepare an official statement," he instructed, his voice as even as it had been throughout the entire exchange, his tone carrying the weight of a man who was already several steps ahead. "I want a full investigation launched immediately. The public deserves transparency, and this company will be the first to provide it." The assistant nodded sharply, her fingers moving swiftly across the screen as she sent out immediate instructions to the corporate communications team. Rebecca's breath hitched audibly this time, her lips parting slightly as she tried to process what was happening, as she struggled to grasp how quickly the situation had spiraled beyond anything she could control. She had not just lost the favor of her superiors, she had lost the ability to silence what had happened. Devon turned back to her then, his expression unreadable, his voice carrying no more weight than it needed to. "You didn't just fail as a flight attendant today," he said, his tone smooth, final, impossible to ignore. "You failed as a representative of this airline. You failed as a professional. And most of all, you failed as a person." Rebecca did not respond. There was nothing left to say. The moment had already passed her by. The truth already moving far beyond this airport, spreading, gaining momentum, turning into something she would never be able to outrun. And Miriam, standing tall beside her son, still composed, still regal in her quiet dignity, had never once needed to demand justice. She had simply let it arrive on its own. The fallout was swift. Within hours, the video of Rebecca's treatment of Miriam had gained national attention, circulating through every major social media platform, picking up traction from news outlets, and forcing the airline to respond with an immediacy rarely seen in corporate scandals. People from all backgrounds weighed in, some expressing outrage, others sharing their own experiences of quiet discrimination, the kind that was difficult to prove but impossible to ignore. The airline had no choice but to act. By the following morning, Devon's official statement had been released, not as a carefully worded attempt to minimize damage, not as an empty apology crafted to pacify the public, but as an unfiltered acknowledgement of failure. He addressed the issue head-on, confirming that an internal investigation had already begun, that Rebecca had been placed on indefinite suspension, that the rest of the crew who had turned a blind eye were also being reviewed, and that systemic changes would follow. There was no vague language, no corporate doublespeak, no attempt to soften the reality of what had transpired. His words made it clear, this was not an isolated incident. This was a symptom of something deeper, and it would not go unchecked. Rebecca had not returned to work. The last report circulating among the airline's employees was that she had resigned before the investigation could conclude, though whether she had done so out of choice or because she had been presented with no alternative was left to speculation. The rest of the crew members who had remained complicit faced their own disciplinary actions, some receiving suspensions, others being required to undergo extensive retraining before they could return to work. There was no sweeping the issue under the rug, no quiet reassignment to another flight route, no quiet exit where they could simply move on without consequences. The world had watched, and the airline had no choice but to change. Days later, the storm had begun to settle, but the impact of what had transpired had not faded. The media cycle moved fast, but some stories left a mark that could not be erased. Miriam sat comfortably in her home, the morning light filtering through the sheer curtains of her living room, her tea steeping in front of her as she watched the news unfold on the television. Her name had been mentioned in articles, in headlines, in opinion pieces discussing the broader implications of what had happened, but she had not given any interviews. She had no need to. The moment had spoken for itself. She had not demanded justice. She had not raised her voice. She had simply let the truth make itself known, and that had been enough. Devon had called her earlier that morning, checking in as he always did, his voice carrying the same unwavering steadiness, though there had been something lighter beneath the surface, something satisfied. "They're still talking about it," he had said, the faintest hint of amusement threading through his words. "I don't think they'll stop any time soon." Miriam had smiled at that, stirring her tea with an absent-minded ease. "Good," she had replied, her voice calm, unshaken, unbothered by the weight of the world's attention. Let them. She had lived a lifetime navigating spaces where she had been told, explicitly and otherwise, that she did not belong. She had learned, over time, that the best way to dismantle that belief was not to fight for acceptance, not to beg for fairness, not to waste energy proving her worth to those who refused to see it. It was to exist fully and unapologetically. And so, as she sat in the warmth of her home, sipping her tea, untouched by the storm that had consumed others, she let herself enjoy the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she had won, not because she had sought revenge, not because she had demanded retribution, but because she had never needed to. The world had simply caught up. The airport terminal thrived with the rhythm of travel, the steady movement of people flowing through the space like a quiet current. The overhead announcements played in timed intervals, directing passengers to their gates, reminding them of last boarding calls, the mechanical voice blending seamlessly into the background hum of rolling luggage, casual conversations, and the occasional burst of laughter from excited children. Near one of the gates, a new flight prepared for boarding. Travelers clustered in small groups, some checking their phones, others adjusting the straps of their carry-ons, or flipping through boarding passes as they waited for their group to be called. The energy was routine, nothing out of the ordinary, yet something beneath the surface had shifted. At the check-in counter, a flight attendant stood, her uniform pressed, her name tag gleaming under the overhead lighting. She moved efficiently, her fingers gliding over the keyboard as she assisted passengers, her expression pleasant but professional, her tone warm without being forced. A woman approached, her first-class boarding pass in hand. She was older, well-dressed, carrying herself with the kind of quiet grace that commanded attention without demanding it. There was something familiar in the way she stood, in the patience with which she waited, in the steadiness of her gaze as she offered her ticket with a polite nod. The flight attendant accepted the boarding pass without hesitation, her posture shifting slightly as she double-checked the seating assignment. Her voice remained warm, inviting, completely free of doubt. "Of course, ma'am," she said with a small smile, her fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced ease. "Let me make sure everything is in order for you." There was no hesitation, no second-guessing, no subtle questioning of whether or not the woman belonged in the seat she had booked. The moment passed as it should have, seamlessly, without incident, without the burden of scrutiny or unnecessary resistance. The exchange was so simple, so unremarkable, so effortlessly normal that it might have been easy to overlook just how significant it was. But change does not always come in loud declarations or grand moments of defiance. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the spaces where things begin to shift, not in speeches or protests, but in the simple, unspoken acknowledgement of what should have always been. From a short distance away, a supervisor observed. She stood near the gate, her presence unintrusive but unmistakable, her sharp gaze taking in everything: the seamless interaction at the check-in counter, the easy professionalism of the crew, the way things moved forward now with a kind of awareness that had not always been there. There was nothing to correct, nothing to step in for, nothing to fix, because this time it was done right the first time. The world did not change overnight, but sometimes it only took a single moment to set things in motion, and Miriam Jenkins had been that moment. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.